Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining me again in this both vlog and podcast series. Deuze vlog available on YouTube, on Anchor, and Spotify. Really appreciate you following this series. As always, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions of me, of my guests. You're very welcome. We love to hear from you. In the session today, I'm truly honored to be joined by two very dear friends and colleagues from completely different parts of the world, wiggling multiple time zones to make this happen. I'm having a conversation today with Saba Bebawi and Bruce Mutsvairo. Saba, as a professor, calling in early in the morning from Sydney, Australia, and Bruce all the way from Auburn, Texas, in the United States, and of course me being here at home in the northeast of England. Let me quickly introduce Saba and Bruce. Saba is a professor at the School of Communication at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. Published a lot about the role of media power and the role of media in democracy building, and focusing specifically on the history and culture of investigative journalism in the Arab world. She has published several books, including the absolutely fabulous 2016 book, Investigative Journalism in the Arab World. With Mark Evans, she just published the book, The Future Foreign Correspondent. And she is a co-editor of the recent Data Journalism in the Global South for Palgrave. And with Bruce, she is a co-editor of a book series with Palgrave, the Palgrave Studies in Journalism and the Global South. And before being academic, she, as many academics in the field of media and journalism studies, including myself and Bruce, she was a professional journalist, broadcasting, producing for Radio Jordan English Service, also doing work for CNN and Dubai Television. She's founder and director of the Foreign Correspondent Study Tour project and the Global Risk Journalism Hub. Bruce, who used to be a colleague of Saba's at UTS, is now a professor of journalism at the School of Communication and Journalism of Auburn University in Texas in the United States. A truly interdisciplinary scholar with interests in digital journalism, democratization, conflict resolution, and human rights. He previously served as an associate professor at UTS in Australia. He was also an assistant professor in the Netherlands at Leiden University, and was a member of the journalism faculty just around the corner from where I live at Northumbria University in Newcastle in the UK. He's written or edited 8 books and published with Amsterdam University Press, Palgrave, Roman, and Littlefield. He's together with Saba and Eddy Borges-Rey, the founding editor of Palgrave Studies in Journalism and the Global South. Co-edited books like Journalism, Democracy, and Human Rights in Zimbabwe, where he is from. The Palgrave Handbook of Media and Communication Research in Africa is also a book that he did. And like Saba and I, he was a journalist before becoming an academic, doing his reporting for the Associated Press. Now, Saba, Bruce and I go way back, but actually never have met in person, even though we've met each other at various places around the world. And we always talk a lot about, and that's what we'll do in this session today, in this conversation today, about, what makes something local specific and what makes it universal, right? Where does influence come from? How does exchange between different cultures, different languages, different regions, different sets of ideals and values and practices, where does it come from? How do we make for a truly diverse practice and field of media and journalism studies without resorting to either, perspectives from the West being imported into non-Western cultures or the other way around, but to truly make it a round table, if you'll forgive me this British metaphor. So this conversation was, as always, a pure joy. I hope you enjoyed as much as I do. Hi, good morning, Saba. Good afternoon, Bruce. Good night to me. Really good to see you and to sort of manage the time zones and everything to get us all together. I'm really happy to see you and to chat with you today. And maybe immediately to get us started. I mean, the fact, Saba, you're in Australia right now in Sydney. Bruce, you're in Auburn, right, in Texas. I'm here in the northeast of the UK, and none of us is from the place where we are. Both in terms of our genealogy, our heritage, but also in terms of where we've worked, where we studied. I mean, we're from all over the place. I'm just assuming that that's a little bit of what we share. I'm always wondering, where do you feel that particular background, like we switched universities during our work, but also as students, we've had careers before, like we were all journalists before we became academics, and we covered, various issues and places around the world. And so, I mean, so we share that background. Whether you feel that background makes you, I mean, obviously not a better, but it's just a different kind of academic as some of your colleagues or the people you meet in the field. I mean, how do you see that, or doesn't it really make that much of a difference? Saba, if I can start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. I'm kind of looking forward to having a chat with you and Bruce. It's a really interesting question because you find that a lot of people do have that. We're all kind of, if I can use a kind of a political term, misplaced or not rightly
Right.
placed, maybe. But we've all kind of moved around and we come from different parents. But I think in our case, maybe there's a little bit of a different story that kind of Bruce can add to, is that we came from very extreme places of the world. And so for me, it's really interesting where I grew up in the UK, but I was born in Jordan, but I'm from an Arab heritage. And I'll say Arab because, there's Moroccan, there's Palestinian, there's Yemeni, and so even that is, and my daughter's Egyptian, so even that is all kind of really complicated in its own political right. But just going straight to your question, Mark, I think it's, I've been thinking about what you're saying because I wake up in the morning and I say, all right, I'm here, I'm in a meeting room at University of Technology, Sydney, UTS, and I'm Australian, right? I'm working in an Australian university with Australian kind of environment, context, policies, economy, social structure. And so I do see myself as Australian. And I don't think of myself as necessarily going around saying I'm Arab. And then I go back to Jordan and I switch Arab, right? I'm just a different person. You become like street smart and you speak the lingo, and it's like even drive like an Arab again. So it's very different. And I've wondered whether I've got these split personalities, and maybe we've just learned to adapt.
Mm.
But I think the background is what we're made of, and it comes out in who we are. So I don't walk around thinking down the streets of Sydney, I'm Arab.
Mm.
I just know that's what makes me confident. And, I think of, you know, back home or the desert or the sea and it's part of, and I was reading a book the other day where even our ancestry is part of our social structure. So I haven't been to Morocco, but my Moroccan genes must be there somehow working
Yeah.
and making me who I am. And I think that comes out in our work. We don't say who we are, but the way we see things and the way we see things a bit differently. And I think Bruce and I will talk about that a little bit more in terms of journalism from the global south, really comes out. So, but I'll pass on to Bruce to kind of tell his story.
Mm.
No, I think what has really made us friends, it's maybe that sort of common, that shared experience, that shared heritage, if you like, the global south that you're talking about. I have a feeling journalism, or working in journalism, gave us, or at least gave me, adventure, a sense of adventure. That I am always prepared for anything, basically. And I think my own background, having been born in Zimbabwe, and moving around as a very young child, moving to different parts of the world, it made me sort of brave, and I was kind of pursuing what I wanted. I knew as a very young person, already at like 6 or 7, I already knew I wanted to be a journalist,
Oh,
because
right.
I really enjoyed news. My father used to send me to buy a newspaper, and I would go to buy a newspaper that was in Zimbabwe then, but I would read the newspaper, and sometimes I would not want to go because you'd ask me to go very early. So reading the newspaper was kind of a protest. I
Mm.
didn't realize, obviously, that was kind of forming part of my future identity, but it did, because I was doing it on a daily basis. And then my interest in newspaper grew, and then I was interested in journalism, seeing Larry King, all these people. It just gave me a sense of adventure,
Mm.
so much so that when I had an opportunity to move out of Zimbabwe, as a 14-year-old, it was not very difficult, because I felt like maybe this is going to give me a chance to fulfill my dream of becoming a journalist. And in a way, it did,
Mm.
because uh, um, that's how then I started studying, or I got opportunities to study. But I also think that background sort of humbles you as a person, in the sense that you don't come from a very rich, well-to-do background.
Mm.
You come from a humble. You have a humble beginning where you're just a common person. And I don't know, if I had come from a very rich family, and I was like I don't know, very rich somebody, perhaps I would not be talking to you right now.
Mm.
But that, just that background of just a normal guy, who was just pursuing his interest. And also, I think that pursuit of those interests, it almost feels like it's a never ending goal. You keep pursuing and looking for new opportunities. And
Right.
it seems like it's where's the end to this? There's no ending. This is who we are. And then you meet like-minded people, like the way I met Saba. And then you become friends. And then you go for dinner, and you talk, and then you feel like, oh, she could be my sister, because her story is almost like my story, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
I think journalism has certainly shaped who we are, our sort of academic journey in that sense, especially particularly when it comes to the fact that it has made me brave and be prepared for anything.
Mm.
I don't know if
That,
that answers your question.
no, it's beautiful. I mean, there's that shared notion of being brave, being courageous, being strong, being. I mean, that kind of like it gives you a kind of confidence, even though you're constantly in uncertain circumstances, right? Trying to
Mhm,
find your feet in new places, new areas of the world, new cultures.
mhm,
And it is funny. Like, obviously, I don't share that particular kind of background, but perhaps what we do in that sense, it's comparable. I mean, nothing is comparable, but I'm a first generation scholar. I'm the first in my entire family who did anything after high school. So I didn't know what a PhD was when I went to university. I just thought, I didn't want to go into military service. So the university. And that was seemed like a pretty, because I was a journalist, and they said, well, yeah, you kind of still have to do military service, dude. I was like in the last section of the Dutch population that had to do that. And they said, what would get me out? It's like, well, if you go to university and then spend some time abroad. And that's how I ended up in South Africa. So anyways, doesn't,
Yeah.
but that, being a first generation student and now seeing in my classroom so many first generation students, much more than ever before, and from all over the world, and then being able to relate to that, I think that and also as a former journalist, I tend to still take academia not so seriously, or think that they take themselves too seriously. I don't know if you recognize that. Like, chill, just tell a good story.
Yeah.
Okay, no, but it is very serious, of course. And talk about serious. Let's talk a little bit about your work, because I mean, you both have done for quite some time a lot of really great and important work about, media in general and journalism in particular. And then Saba, for you, especially across the Arab world. Bruce, you've published a lot about media and journalism throughout Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. And it seems to me, but you're in a better position to assess this, that kind of work, and work that specifically looks at, like you say, look at media and journalism in the global South or non-Western or whatever, is not only becoming more noticed and more sort of, there's a growing interest and a sense of urgency around it. But what I personally find different about that, having lived in South Africa and been following this literature, is that in the past, that popularity would be, oh, look, here's an American professor writing a book about journalism in Kenya or something like that, and have this sort of, look at these people kind of perspective. But this is more, and I wouldn't say indigenous perspective, but more sort of like a perspective that are actually grounded in that place. Not necessarily different because of that, but still there's a different quality to that. And also the kind of authors you bring into the edited volumes you put together. I wonder how you look at sort of your own work in the context of this development. Do you also see this growing popularity and this change in the narrative about media in the global South?
Saba?
Saba.
You want to start?
Sure. I think we've got lots to add to this, Bruce, because we've had a lot of conversations about this.
Right.
And I think, Mark, you've touched in, the heart of what we always talk about when we talk about projects or about our work and what drives us. A few comments on that. I mean, the first thing is, I think I recognize that my frustration stems back from being a journalist in Jordan. And at that time, we didn't have Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English and a lot of these kind of Arab kind of Pan Am voices in the media. And what I would watch are CNN or BBC reports, especially when I was working with CNN in the region, is that there was this reporting on, especially, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Iraqi war, any kind of bombings or even peace talks were from a very kind of a Western perspective. And I would be shouting at the television in the living room or in the newsroom saying, just get an Arab to tell the story, get an Arab journalist to tell the story, and it will be very different from this very superficial and very basic view. Now, I'm being general here. There are some amazing Western foreign correspondents who have actually provided interesting knowledge. And there's a book, The Future Foreign Correspondent, which I co-authored with Professor Mark Evans, which we talk about, the local and the advantages of having the local journalists, but also the advantages of having a fresh eye from the outside. So not one is better than the other. So we need both, is what I'm saying. But from a journalism research perspective, I do want to add in terms of the Arab research, I am not the first Arab researcher. There are a string of amazing Arab academics who have written about the Arab world. I can name them endlessly, and I'm having the privilege of working with a lot of them right now. So I'm building on their work.
Mm.
But what I'm probably focusing on a little bit more and a little bit differently is the idea of the culture of journalism, or journalism cultures, and how we can understand these practices from, you know, especially a kind of Arab culture, identity, way of thinking, even things like how people go about their everyday life, either from an audience perspective, and why journalism is the way it is. And that's my work on investigative journalism models at the moment. And again, this is building on work, Thomas Hanish's World of Journalism. I'm not the first one. Barbie Zelizer has also worked on this. You yourself have done amazing work that I build on that too, Mark. So I think this is, you know, it's trying to kind of understand things differently, but from, yes, an inside perspective. And yeah, I think what we're finding is that there's a lot of, and Bruce, I'm kind of segueing to you now, is that we, you know, especially Bruce has been kind of the idea that there's so many amazing researchers from the region that don't always have the opportunities to publish and show their work. And we're hoping that more of that will come through the projects we're working on. But I'll hand it over to Bruce to comment on that.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, Saba, and you know, very important issues there that you touched on. I think for me, first of all, for me, it was when I was doing my master's at Cardiff University. That was in 2005, I think. That's a long time ago. I was in one course. I wrote a paper, and in this paper, I cited some some scholars from Zimbabwe. You know, Dumisani Moyo, Last Moyo, Sarah Chumbu. These were people that I was reading at that time who are more senior scholars compared to me. And, you know, I was a student then, and they had already finished their PhDs, and they were, you know, trying to sort of raise their names in journalism and media studies in Africa. Now, I cited one, I can't remember, one or some of, or if not all, in a paper. And my teacher said as feedback at that time, it is maybe a good idea to cite well-established scholars, you know. And actually, these were well-established scholars.
Right.
But I think the reason why, you know, the teacher thought they were not was just because they were not called John Smith or something like that, you know. And I think I got my drive from that. I think it's one incident that when that happened, I said, you know, if I get an opportunity to be in the academia, I want to go in there with drive and determination to try and raise these issues. Because, you know, and look, obviously this person did not mean anything harmful, was not a bad person. But I think, and you know, now going into your question, Mark, I think we are very lucky because of the timing. For us, time right now, things are just happening at the really right time. That, you know, if I had written a proposal to Palgrave, you know, with Saba and you know and Eddy, and say, hey, we want to do a book on journalism in the global South. I don't know, 35 years ago, I don't know if they would have even have replied to that email. You know, it's like, who are these people in the first place? You know. You know. but now it's like, you know, we were in Sydney, Sab and I, thinking about this idea and saying like, oh, this is a brilliant idea, we need to do it. And then of course, you know, everything happens coincidentally, as you know, Mark. The editor at that time actually came to our office to meet us. You know, it's like, tell us if you have any ideas, you know. Right. And we were like, are you serious? We never run out of ideas, you know. So we went for lunch with her, Saba and I, and we were like, hey, this is what we want to do. And she was like, oh my God, you should have done this last month or last year. Why have you not been doing this? This is a fantastic idea. So
Great.
I think for, so it's not really more like credit to us. We are also lucky because, as you know, Mark, it's not, I think in this academia, in this journey that we are all on, it's not really just about being smart and being talented and having the best ideas. You have to rely on other people. That's just the way it is. It's never your own thing. Everybody has been at one point has been assisted by somebody, and that sort of shapes your date with destiny as far as your career is concerned. So in that sense, I think we've been lucky that many people today are talking about the global south. I mean, commercially, because of course books, they want to make money, but also I think genuinely, it's not, I don't think this is only about making money. I think this, and we don't want to take credit because we are quite sure there are other people who tried to do this before, but maybe the timing was not right and nobody listened to them, and nobody at that time really realized the importance of doing some stuff like what we are doing right now. It was just like, oh, come on, nobody will be interested. But now there's interest commercially, to make money out of this. But also there are, critical questions that are being asked by people like, why is this field dominated by, this sort of colonial bondage, if you like, most of these countries in the South, they have gotten out of colonialism many years. Why are these people not having a chance to be given a voice to tell their own stories? But, I'm sure, these questions have been asked many years ago, but it takes time for maybe somebody to then say, oh, yeah, maybe, maybe we should give them a chance. And I think that is what happened to us, not just through publication, but you also have to look at it more like having a job, being a professor, being, a Black African, being, an Arab woman, being a professor in a Western university. It's not something maybe that was possible many years ago. But many universities, many administrators today are talking about diversity and inclusion, and maybe the thinking has changed. So that's why I always think like I don't want to give myself too much credit as like, oh, look what I've done. I think we are also grateful to the timing, to the developments that are happening, during the time that we are trying to raise a flag on these important issues.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, some time ago for this vlog and podcast series, I had a conversation with Claudia Meleado, who you know as well, of course, and she said something similar, right? That for her it was also frustrating that in the past people would sort of, especially like you would say American or British colleagues would sometimes, well, let's have Claudia as well, or somebody like her to have Latin America voices or something. And how that is changing, that you now have a much more sort of confident and autonomous sort of voice coming out of Latin America, not necessarily needing to be published in, American journals or something, but just having an autonomous voice, and that there's a more genuine sort of exchange, not just because of diversity and inclusion, but that, and so there's a beginning there of a shifting of a combination or a mixing of perspectives. That's I noticed that as well when doing the research for the McQuail book. It's like I mean, in the past it was like, well, we'll cherry pick some inclusive voices, and now it's like, well, no, there's this amazing world of scholarship that only now we're beginning to open our eyes to, which is interesting. I mean, which brings me to another question that I wanted to ask about your work. I mean, you mentioned your collaboration with Palgrave and the recent volume that you put together on data journalism in the Global South. And in that book, one of the many things you talk about is how that one way of looking at data journalism and how it works in the Global South and how it works in journalism in generally, is to not look at it from the perspective of a very specific story or publication, but more in terms of the collaboration that goes on to make data journalism possible. And often these collaborations are transnational in nature. the most high profile one, obviously the Panama Papers, but so many projects, also smaller projects, have that element of transnational collaboration. And I think we temporarily lost Bruce, but I'll keep going. What did they say? We'll fix it in post. And now, so it's a similar question to my previous one. Is that in if you think of transnational collaboration between sort of, let's say, the West or the global North and the rest of the world, there's often this assumption that there is then influencing going on from Western perspectives and norms and values to, for example, Eastern Europe or the African continent or Latin America or whatnot, the Arab world. But what I know from the scholarship on any form of cultural exchange, both in the past and the present, is that whatever is influencing gets influenced back. And I wonder, in your work, how do you see that happening? What gets introduced into, let's just, for argument's sake, say the Western sort of world of journalism and or journalism scholarship, from collaborating with or even looking carefully at the scholarship and journalism in, for example, the Arab world or in Africa or in Latin America? I mean, how do you see the two-way process, if that makes any sense?
I'll hand over to Bruce on this one because he spearheaded the data journalism project. So.
Well, yes, thanks, Saba, thanks, Mark. I think the process of interchangeable ideas is certainly present. This is not a one-way traffic, because when we are writing a book like this, for example, we want to write about journalism, right? There's no way we are not going to cite or read the work of scholars in the West, right? We use their work, like the work of scholars like you, as kind of a point of departure, because whether we like it or not, the fact is the Western scholarship has dominated, say, our field for many years, right? So we can't just ignore that and appear as if like there wasn't anything that was there before we tried to get in. We need to acknowledge the work of those people who have done research in this area before us. But not only that, I think in order for us to actually gain any sort of recognition in what we are trying to do, we clearly need the support of people like yourself, right? Because when somebody like you, a respected scholar in journalism, when you actually then say, oh, this is a good book, there is a big following that is going to listen to you, or when you say, oh, this book is waste of time, and I think it is also strategic on our part, because if we were to be arrogant and say like, oh, we know it all, or oh, we are not going to listen to what they are doing, or try to create sort of a war path between us and them, I think it almost feels like we are fighting a losing battle, because we actually benefit from having people like you, speaking good of the work that we are doing, just like you also benefit from us, speaking good of the work that you have done, right? Because I mean, we are in the academia. It's our job is to critique each other's work. So I see this not only as us getting something from Western scholars, but I also see Western scholars getting something from us. For example, you asking us to have a chat like this, it must have come from somewhere, I've been asked, and I'm sure Saba, Eddy, and people who have contributed to that volume have been asked to speak in classes here in the US, globally. I think that is because scholars in the West realize that, this work cannot just be ignored. It's just there, and even if you try to ignore it, as I think maybe people in the past tried to do, you can't ignore it because they just keep bringing more and more work, and it's important, I suppose, to be asking the questions that we are asking, because we actually realize, in this more sort of globalized world, the issues are the same. It's like, I was talking to Miriam de Brown, who supervised my PhD, about disinformation and how disinformation is really big in Mali, where she does all her work. And she was like, oh, but we could say exactly the same about America. That was the time that, there was, when pro-Trump supporters went into Capitol. That was exactly on that day. And it was very coincidental because we were like, oh yeah, so it's not just, you can't just talk of issues that are specifically targeting one country, but the issues are more or less global. I mean, they have their own sort of cultural or contextual, variations, but the issues, I think they speak to a more sort of global population. And
Right.
so in that sense, I think collaboration between Western and non-Western scholars is just a must. It's a must because we are talking and dealing with issues that are exactly the same, but maybe we just speak to a different public.
Saba, if I may follow up, this maybe more specific to your earlier work and the work that you're doing at the moment about. I mean, you wrote this really fabulous book, and it is fabulous, about investigative journalism across the Arab world and different journalism cultures. And I mean, for many reasons, this is a fascinating case. Also because there are examples of investigative journalism in the Arab world that have this sort of, I mean, when we think about the position of a station like Al Jazeera or something like that, that is populated by both local journalists and then former BBC journalists and CNN people, and it's sort of like an interesting mix. And then all the Western media around the world originally reporting from or about the Arab world through correspondence, and then increasingly withdrawing and relying more and more on local journalists to supplement or even take over that kind of reporting for all kinds of reasons. So I mean, I would imagine there's this really interesting sort of exchange going on that isn't necessarily deliberate or conscious, but it has to happen. I mean, have you seen that in your work? I mean, is there an awareness about that, or is it really different worlds that bump up against each other?
No, oh my God, I can write a whole book on just that, right?
Please do.
With you and Bruce.
Yes, I'm writing. Yes,
right.
what publication dates, Saba?
No, it's a fantastic topic, right? And a lot of the kind of work that I do builds on that. But how am I going to answer that question? Because I've got a lot in my mind, but I will kind of be specific in terms of what you're saying about the collaboration. I mean, the Panama Papers was just one fantastic example where Arab, and I'm going to talk about investigative journalism because that's what I'm working on at the moment and have been, is that they finally, they've been training. Might I add on the side that a lot of my work looks into how we can develop an Arab investigative journalism model. I'm talking to Arab journalists and they said, we still need the Western kind of tools, the way of investigating, the process, building on a hypothesis, the kind of, structured investigations. But we need, the content is Arab issues and also the way some areas we have to tweak. So we put in an FOI, a Freedom of Information request, and it's going to be denied. It's not like what you get, say, here in Australia or in Europe. So we have to go and, talk to our cousin at the ministry and invite him over for lunch and we get the information we need, it's guaranteed. So unfortunately, Arab journalists are still aware of particular ways. And this is how they can, I think we've lost Bruce for a while, but this is how, it can help Western journalists. But going back to the Panama Papers, it was the first time for an Arab investigative journalist to really feel part of this global project and show what they've learned and show how they can access information that non-Arab journalists or investigative journalists find hard to access, simply because of those examples of that ministry where, only the Arab journalists can get it, and where they usually probably worked as fixers, not as journalists. So now they're getting the full role of reporting on the story from start to finish. Really good examples are endless. I mean, Bruce talks about access of Arab or global South researchers with the help of Western scholars. It goes the same with journalists. So, there was, I talk about it in my book about how one female, Khandaqji, her name is, investigative Arab reporter from Jordan, exposed how orphanages were mistreating children. And it actually led to a wonderful task force being set up by the Jordanian government. So this is an example of where actually the state was helping and responding, and it revamped orphanages in Jordan. The secret there, it was a collaboration with BBC. It was Arab, and that's why it had this global coverage. So that story, for it to lead to social change within Jordan, needed that platform, that BBC platform. And again, I've spoken to investigative journalists from the Philippines who have been talking about the drug war and how they did the groundwork, but it was, and I will be anonymous here, but it was done by a Reuters journalists, and the story was published after the Reuters journalists had left the Philippines, but they're the ones who published it under their name, whereas the investigative journalists had done the work, but we don't know about it, right? So, but that's just how these collaborations. And when I asked these journalists from the Philippines, how do you feel about working on this investigative story and your names are not there and nobody knows about it? And they said, well, we just wanted the story to come out and only we could do it. And the only way for it to come out was this way. We don't care about our names. Of course, I had a tear in my eye. And, it was like, wow, that's real journalism for journalism's sake. And so Bruce has spoken about the scholarship. I'm talking about the practice, but I think the collaboration is important for different reasons, but also the insight that local journalists bring in, or local journalism scholars bring in to, the global north and vice versa. I think it's really important that we don't, as you say, Mark, have that wall, those different camps, but there's this collaboration. And I think it's happening. I mean, this is a true example, as Bruce said.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you make a point that in your work at some point about how, as these collaborations and these exchanges are happening, and some techniques get sort of copied and pasted, but that there still are very distinct types of journalisms that belong to specific local traditions that have to do with language and with customs, and also with how journalism is understood locally. And one thing that it's a tiny detail perhaps, but it really inspired me, that notion of how and correct me if I'm wrong, but that you make this point that a lot of journalism in the Arab world has a much more emotional, emotive style, and also that and heritage. You see this also in Southern Europe, where journalism education is often like you read the great literary classics first, right, and then you can become a journalist, and which also leads to a specific style of reporting. And I was thinking about that because with Charlie Beckett, I've been doing some work on looking at how journalism in Europe are needing and embracing a more emotional style, and getting more into, because they need that in order to cover certain topics well, like the refugee crisis, for example. I mean, if you don't do that with empathy, and if you don't do that with sort of, yeah, with in a much more emotive way, people won't identify with it. It won't really bring home that story. I mean, it almost seems like I mean, hey, we in the global north can learn a lot from that style of reporting. Or is that a bit too simplistic? I don't know.
Not at all. And I find your comment really fascinating because even, I still think as an Arab journalist and Arab scholar. So what I mean by that is seeing it from an Arab perspective. And I guess in my work, and maybe now I'm feeling we need to work again on this together and rethink this in more detail. Because I was seeing it one way where this notion of emotive journalism that I call, we're trying to get rid of it in Arab journalism. We're trying, especially investigative journalism, we're trying to be more fact-based, and it was used as a mechanism to, in the previously to, or traditionally, to guide the audiences and manipulate them in a sense. And but then and the problem with all of that, of course, has been that the facts have been misconstrued. But what you're saying, Mark, is also really interesting, is maybe we shouldn't, as Arab journalists, lose all that, because if, you're bringing that example of Western journalists are actually adopting it and heading, maybe this is a really good example of what you're saying, where we reach middle ground. We see, how do you use emotive reporting without losing the facts and misguiding or misleading the audiences, but also bringing it closer to them. So maybe this is a way where we can find the positives and reach a middle ground where we find this, yes, we can still do emotive language, but or emotive journalism, using a middle ground, and I think that only comes with collaboration, scholarly and practically in
Yeah.
journalism.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to me, that's such a fascinating idea. Is to, I mean, it is also a bit naive, perhaps, to think of like let's just identify the cherries in all the different journalisms that we know of and that we find, whether they're in Zimbabwe or in South Africa or in Jordan or in Egypt or wherever, and then just put them all together, and that is that is truly the world of journalism. I don't know if it could be that simple, but I love that idea. And maybe that's also a product of who we are, right? Of having lived all over the world, we ourselves are kind of the ultimate colonizers. And still authentic in some ways, but maybe extending this just a little bit, because this collaboration also has a potential problematic side that also in your work comes out, which is, and I know this personally from my time when I was living and working in South Africa, that in journalism education there and in neighboring countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia, for example, a lot of Western, especially American companies, NGOs, and also universities were coming in or were called in to sort of develop and offer all kinds of journalism training and education. And or they would fund those kind of institutes and research and everything. And this was the mid 1990s. But I distinctly remember at the time this sort of very intense debate in Southern Africa about, like, what do we do with this, right? I mean, on the one hand, this is exciting because to adopt or Western or American style of journalism, yeah, like you said, fact-based, objective, gives us legitimacy and authority and a voice in fast changing societies at the time. On the other hand, are we losing our Africanness as journalists, right? I mean, what is African journalism vis-a-vis this kind of new ideology that we're all being taught with, or that pays the bills? And I wonder, where do you, I mean, and you call that this is a distinct risk and for example, now data journalism is becoming very popular. Transnational collaboration between journalists is very popular. A political economy analysis would suggest, well, there is this risk that there's a growing dependency on or influence by these Western agents and actors. How do you look at this discussion now? Is it still that same discussion, or is there something else going on that we should know about? Maybe Bruce, you can kick us off with this. Oh, you're on mute, my friend.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Hey, there you go.
Sorry, as you
good
can
to have you
see,
back.
I keep moving. Sorry, thanks. I was hearing you, but I keep moving it. My internet is not very good, but I'm now using my mobile. So
yeah,
it should be
America fine. Internet. That's
talking of the digital divide. It's busy. So anyway, I think it's a good question, Mark. What I can say is, again, time really is a good healer. We are now, finding ourselves in, with a new generation of scholars who are asking critical questions. Okay. If you look at that decolonial debate, which has also been extended into the field of journalism studies, it's not something that I think can easily be wished away. The new generation of scholars that we are getting today, they are asking questions. What is journalism from an African perspective? If we say, the first newspaper in or on the African continent was established by the French in the 1700s in Mauritius, are we then saying the people who were living, our forefathers, the African people who lived before the 1700s, they didn't really do any form of journalism? Or maybe they practiced journalism, but they didn't call it journalism.
Right.
Or they called it something. But it's like there has always been this sort of Eurocentric interdependence, on scholarship. And you can't, there's nothing you can do about that, because obviously colonialism influenced, the ideas of the people in sub-Saharan Africa and, much of the global South, just because of history, because of what has happened. But I have a feeling that even though we had a lot of scholars who were asking those critical questions, perhaps already 100 years ago, I think they didn't have, the agency maybe that we have, the tools that we have today, that sort of, you can't, I mean, if somebody's asking stuff on Twitter, it's probably going to reach more people than if somebody was going to ask the same questions using a telegram, I don't know, 100 years ago. So I have a feeling, the nature of these digital technologies, the changes that are happening, the questions, the fact that the history of these African states, the books in these African countries were written by American scholars. And at that time, it was really seen as a good thing. I mean, it was a good thing, say, because of course, maybe there was nothing. But at that time, I always think like, most of the forefathers, people from maybe my heritage who lived in Africa, they were not lesser than the people in Europe or America. But I have a feeling they just never recorded anything.
Right.
They just, I think the people who were there, the Europeans who were there, they were good at recording, and they recorded everything, and everything they recorded provided a narrative which was shared, or which has been shared for many years, which has made people believe that that's exactly the way it is. But now I think with this new breed of, of academics, but also of journalists, questions are being raised, questions are being asked. And I think that, it's good to have a debate. I mean, that's the whole purpose of being in the academia, right? In the first place. I mean, if you didn't want to debate, you'll probably choose another, profession. And I think it's not like there is one of these two that is better than the other. because even if we were to say African journalism is better than, journalism which has been written by the Americans, or with the, books written by the Europeans, we would still need to acknowledge that they were the ones who actually started writing. We can't just again wish them away. So for me as a scholar, I think it's a combination of, these two different strands that actually makes this journalism scholarship that is emerging out of Africa stronger. You need to understand the history. Where is it coming? I mean, if you look at media studies, for example, in Zimbabwe, one of the key, scholars is a Norwegian who actually started, media studies at the University of Zimbabwe, Helge Ronning,
Mhm.
and you know the name. And so, I mean, you cannot discredit. I mean, the fact that Helge comes from Norway, yeah, we can't change that. But it's also a fact that he's like the godfather of media studies in Zimbabwe, because he started it. And the fact that he was a white man coming from Europe does not make it lesser, because it's a fact that he did it. So I think in as much as maybe sometimes people get also emotive about it, about the injustices of the past, and you cannot ignore the fact that the role that this scholarship, that even if it was biased against Africans, you can't ignore it, or you can't just say like it's not that important, because it's because of that scholarship that we've been able to actually critique and ask questions and to be where we are today.
And if I may pitch the question to you, Saba, and maybe also in the context of the paper that you and Bruce recently wrote, where you looked at the curricula in across the Arab world and in Africa, and how they sometimes seem to almost bypass or ignore their own local context in these curricula, right? In favor of a more streamlined, sort of universal almost journalism education, rather than, or at least next to, as Bruce is suggesting, a local specificity. How do you look at this sort of, at the risk that a more universal idea of journalism, including specific techniques and ways of doing things that may or may not be quite valuable in and of themselves, brings to local cultures or local ways of doing things?
Thanks, Mark. I'll actually respond and just absolutely agree with everything Bruce said. I think it's applicable in many parts of the global South, if not generalizing, like all of them. But I mean, I'll just bring a little story that I noticed. And well, it's not a story as much as it's from my observation of the training of Arab investigative journalists when I started this project 7-8 years ago. I noticed that the training would happen with either American, European trainers or coaches. And one particular example is a very respected friend and colleague, Mark Hunter, who's an investigative journalism, and he's written the handbook for UNESCO. And he was training, he's a remarkable, and he was training these Arab journalists. And so I met with him after for lunch, and I said, look, I read a little bit of your handbook, and you're teaching these Arab journalists the history of Arab journalism from an American history. Like, you're telling them the history of investigative journalism in the US, where, there's, the Fifth Amendment and freedom of speech. And this is like, these guys have just come out of the Arab Spring. What are you talking about? And he's so smart. He's like, Saba, I know. Why don't you write it? Why don't you write the history of our investigative journalism? Yeah. And I went, oops, I should have stayed quiet, because it was a massive challenge. It was a massive challenge. As Bruce said, it is not recorded. It is not documented. And I remember sitting there and trying to put together, I think this work still needs to be expanded on by many Arab scholars, that I had to go to Arab sources in Arabic language and trying to bring it out and trying to put a narrative together, which was used as a little section in the handbook, thanks to Mark Hunter. But as I'm saying, I think it's still more to learn in the lessons learned from the past. Yeah, I guess I think that's probably a good example of training. Now, let's be honest here. There is some reality we need to take into account. An Arab journalist, with all my love and respect for them, would usually take more seriously a Western coach, someone who comes from a non-Arab background, to that of an Arab, because that, you know, they look up to, they're the ones who learned it properly, they're the ones who did it properly. You know, and even though we can argue where journalism started, I mean, Arab had their own way of, you know, circulating news, especially through poetry, which I talk about in my work. So, you know, like, it didn't start somewhere, it started everywhere somewhere, but it's just not documented. And I think that slowly there's this notion from Arab journalists and Arab scholars too, that or, you know, and generally from the global South, that to accept knowledge and information from other Arab scholars and journalists, and trust them too, not just, you know, oh, he's American, I'm going to listen to him. He knows what he's saying. I'm going to attend that training because it's done by this well-known, you know, English journalist. So I think we need to lose that, and we're slowly losing it, because I think everyone can bring something in and learn from each other, as Bruce said. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's just kind of little snippets here and there of thoughts that came in my mind while you were asking the question and Bruce was talking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm happy to hear that we do see a sense of a shift in, you know, a more Euro or Western centric way of looking at things than sort of a beginning of an exchange based on notions of diversity, inclusion, and now to perhaps a more mutual collaboration, right? Where there's at least acknowledgement that everybody has got something to say, and that there's more confidence in every part and of actually saying it. I know that's perhaps a naive or optimistic reading of things, but your work certainly contributes to all of this, and like we talked about before we hit the record button. It's so good to have you here, and to have the three of us talking to each other. I mean, like, at various instances we've met. I mean, like, you were both in Australia, of course. I mean, we've met in Moscow, in in Amsterdam, in all these different parts of the world, and in Madrid, but we never actually met face to face. So it seems kind of appropriate that under COVID conditions, here we are, finally having that beautiful chat. So thank you so much of taking the time of getting up early.
Thanks for inviting us. It's a nice opportunity to be able to talk about these things outside the publication, right?
Yeah, it's really a great opportunity to interact, because, as you know, sometimes when you don't have a platform, or you can't just simply go and record yourself and start talking about these things, otherwise you look like an idiot. So it's good to actually have a platform to be asked it, and then, you know, try and share these ideas. Thanks so much for that, Mark.